when we interrupted. Would you like to kick off then?
Okay, thank you, Susan. Well, I'm going to say there's three things about the speech we've just heard, I'm not going to summarise it, but just there's a lot of very nice words in there, I think, which very few people would disagree with. Sometimes you can call those sort of things like hooray words, precisely because no one ever disagrees with them. So the ironclad commitment to fiscal discipline, again, that's very welcome to hear. And we will show that we will increase growth. I think no one would disagree with that. So the ambitions are clearly there for a better, more healthy and more sustainable UK economy in the ambitions. There were some contradictions, though, I think, in the speech, and that would be my second point, because there is a constant refrain that you hear at the moment from Conservative politicians that we have the highest tax rate in 70 years and the lowest growth. Just putting those two thoughts next to each other doesn't mean they're linked. I mean, I think we should be absolutely clear about that. And when you're thinking about causality, you should be very, very careful about saying that the high tax burden that the UK has is causing the low growth rate. The high tax burden is almost certainly is 99% caused by the fact that we have more demands on public services because we have an older and ageing population than we used to. And we also live in a more dangerous world. So we all know what's going on in Ukraine. And so then we have a choice as a society to whether we want to help people with education, particularly with healthcare or long-term care, in which case, to run ironclad fiscal discipline, you will need higher taxes to do so. There is no simple way around that. And a second contradiction was that there was a commitment to fiscal discipline without a plan or a description of what fiscal discipline meant, except that it would mean debt falling as a share of GDP in the medium term, while we know it's going to rise a lot in the short term because of the action we need to take to help households through the current cost of living crisis. So that means we essentially got a fiscal rule which is a ratchet, an upward ratchet in debt as a share of GDP. Whenever something goes wrong, we think it's fine to borrow a huge amount, and then we say that maybe in 5 years' time we can just about show it coming down again. And we've done that through the financial crisis, through the COVID crisis, now through the cost of living crisis. That is not, in the end, going to get us an ironclad fiscal discipline. So there is a contradiction there. Thirdly, I think another contradiction is that we need to be very careful about talking about tax cuts necessarily creating growth. In the short term, as Stuart said, they might increase demand in the economy, but when you've got full employment and the lowest unemployment in 50 years, you have to assume the Bank of England will offset that with higher interest rates, so it doesn't generate growth there. And then when you're thinking about the supply side, you need to be absolutely sure that your tax cuts actually do have positive supply benefits. So, for example, a cut in direct taxes on labour means that you do take home more of. The government takes less of your money, so that might make you work harder. But if you have a certain standard of living you want to work for, you actually don't have to work as much. It's not clear in economic terms whether that creates growth or not. And in things like the IR35 changes, which essentially mean that the government is not going to enforce, it's not going to change the rules that people who can disguise employment as self-employment as employment, disguise employment as self-employment, they're just not going to enforce it. And that's simply going to encourage evasion, tax evasion, essentially. So we have £2 billion of expected tax evasion coming. Now, so those are the criticisms I'd have of the speech, which are essentially what we expected. I think there were some very hopeful signs in there as well. So I want to leave on an up note. We can improve regulations. I think it's wrong to say we can't. We can improve planning, building, and the Chancellor made that clear. We can even make investments zones work well. They don't necessarily work well, as we know from bitter experience in the past, but these things can work. But let's not kid ourselves on how quickly they work or how big they are. The economy is really big. These things are all quite small. So we shouldn't expect the long-term trend growth of rate to get back to 2.5% in the near term, unless something happens which is really lucky, because we don't really understand why it fell. We don't think we've got massively worse as a society. So it could just happen that we get a lot better, but we shouldn't count on it, and we shouldn't go around saying that these policies will necessarily do it, because governments have been doing that for the past 15 years and they've all failed.
Thank you. John, I'm conscious that in the middle of that there was housing mentioned, and I think that's one of your specialist areas, so perhaps you might want to make a couple of comments.
Well, some people might say I'm far too obsessed with it, many in fact. So I think what we need to do now is see more details of the promised supply-side regulatory reforms. You know, we've seen as a country relative decline until our GDP per head is now 30% lower than that of the US and 17% lower than that of Germany. I do not think we are stuck there if we work on it intelligently. I think there are a number of sectors, including housing, where I simply don't believe anyone can do the detailed work and still think that those sectors are well run. So I think it's great to hear that the government is keen to do more on housing and infrastructure. They are not the first government to try. There have been probably 70 years of failed attempts to reform the planning system, and so I hope that they are going to be smarter about it than previous governments have been. Land under UK homes is worth 1/2 of all non-financial assets, which is a greater distortion than any other large developed country, and that causes immense damage to human health and welfare. It damages jobs, it damages opportunity, and it damages growth. But there are other things as well. They could reform education, so kids from low-income families aren't tricked into doing worthless degrees that give them a very expensive holiday but leave them worse off afterwards. They could reform childcare so that parents aren't paying as much for childcare as they are for mortgages. Other countries do this better. They can fix the energy market so prices reflect the true marginal cost of electricity in different places rather than the insanely distorted system we have now. All of those measures will help growth, maybe not immediately, but over the long term. I think we need to know more about the details on that.
Okay, thank you. Stuart, over to you.
Okay, I'll be even briefer because I want to allow some time for questions and discussion, and I agree with, I think, almost everything that Chris and John both said. So I'll just kind of partly repeat and partly add. I think the relentless focus on growth is a very good idea. I mean, it has been a problem, the fact that the UK growth rate has fallen so much in recent decades. I don't think, contrary to some of what the new leadership have been saying, that's been ignored and no one's been thinking about it or talking about it, but it could definitely be more of a focus, and I agree that there are things that can be done, but it is difficult. For one thing, there's not going to be one magic bullet that makes a huge difference. It's a lot of small things in different areas. Some of them are technically difficult, some of them are politically difficult. As Chris said, we don't fully understand the causes of growth and why it slowed down so much. So it may not be that easy to get it up, but I think there are things we can do, and the focus on it is a very good thing. But to go back to what I was saying at the start, I would be wary of banking that and just kind of assuming that we'll get to 2.5% trend growth, and that's how we will sort out the public finances. And I suspect that's one thing that was worrying the markets in the mini budget, just was the implication that, don't worry, we'll get to 2.5% growth, and that's how we can afford the tax cuts. I think it's great to focus on growth. If we can do it, then we should, and we should try hard to do that. But we need to do something that's going to be sustainable on the public finances, even if growth doesn't take off to quite the degree that the Chancellor hopes.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to open the floor up to questions and online. All right, I've got a gentleman behind you. Put his hand up very quickly. Can I take one from Chris? Yep.
I'm Joseph Hollywood. I work policy practice. And so about £19 billion benefits go claimed every year. Part of what we do is basically automating people of the benefits, help
Okay, can I take one from online? Have you got?
Yeah, I've got a question here posted by someone online, and it's to do with corporation tax. So the question is, will the reversal of the planned increase to corporation tax attract investors to the UK, or isn't it the case that business is more concerned with the ease of doing business rather than the headline rate of tax?
Okay. Do you want to take first?
Yeah, I'll take each of those. So to start with, take the second one first. Will a lower rate of corporation tax attract investment to the UK? Yes, it will help. There is, good evidence that investment does move in response to tax rates. But I would also agree with the second half of that question. Tax is not the only thing that matters. It's probably not the most important thing that matters. So the ease of doing business is certainly one thing. Macroeconomic and political stability is enormously important, and what we've seen over the last couple of weeks hasn't really helped on that front. And there are many other things you can do. Also, as John mentioned earlier, even within corporation tax, the headline rate is not all that matters, and setting the annual investment allowance permanently at £1 million is also a good and welcome thing that was done in the mini budget, if it does in fact turn out to be permanent. Because one problem we've had is the annual investment allowance yo-yoing up and down over the years. So yes, a lower headline rate can help to attract investment, but it's one of a lot of things that you need to look at there. Helping people claim benefits that they're entitled to, what will that do for growth? I think, off the top of my head, I mean, in a way, it's another kind of giveaway. So there's a short-run demand effect, which is putting money into people's pockets, and yes, they will spend some of that, and lower income people tend to spend more of whatever they get. But at the moment, given where they are, that'll all help. That'll all add to the pressure for increases in interest rates, which will at least partly offset that. I mean, in the longer run on the supply side, I guess I might think that once you're claiming this thing, it reduces incentives to work because you can then potentially lose the benefits. But, I mean, while I think those things are right, frankly, the effect on growth is not what I would focus on here. Fundamentally, there are people here who, might very much benefit from the support. And of course, there are questions as to why they are not claiming it at the moment. And it could be people who are in real need who don't realise what they're entitled to and therefore don't claim. There are obvious things you can do about that. It may be that people just find it too difficult or too stigmatising, whatever. There are things you can do about that. But I think, the effect on the people involved is what I would focus on here rather than the effect on wider economic growth.
I'll make a very quick comment on Joseph's question. I think we have to think of it as neutral for growth. I think that's the only way to think of it. You should think of it as if society wants people to have these benefits, if they meet a certain criteria, then we should want them to get it. And we should raise the tax that's necessary to pay for it, either in the short term, in which case it's clearly neutral for growth, or in the medium term, where you'll have to raise the tax because if you have an ironclad commitment to public finances, that means you can't just borrow for it. And any borrowing effect that there might be in the very, very short term will be offset by your monetary policy, and that's the way to think about it. So there might be some very short-term ups or downs, but that should never be a claim that you want to make in favour of the policy or a claim you want to make against the policy.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, we've got a gentleman here and the lady over here.
Also from the Centre for Cities. What would you like to say, or what should the Chancellor be saying on the 23rd of November when he gives his, is he calling it budget? I'm confused now.
Okay, and the lady over in the green.
Hi, Rosalie Monroe, the Institute of Certified Bookkeepers. I was just wondering whether the emphasis on productivity as a driver for growth is misplaced misplaced given that over the last 12 years the government have had a focus on it, and also given the fact that we are at near full employment with record numbers of vacancies.
Yeah, so I'll take those in. Paul, so what should they say? I think they clearly have to have some fiscal rules that have credibility, and they shouldn't just be the loosest thing that you can possibly have, such that you can meet the phrase bringing debt down as a share of GDP in the medium term. There is a real danger that we'll get into a situation where we will not meet Gordon Brown's golden rule in any way. He fudged it loads. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He was the worst person at changing the rules when it didn't suit him. But we didn't approve of that at the time. We shouldn't approve of it if a Conservative government does it now. So I think the rules have to have credibility behind them, and then the meeting of the rules, because let's face it, the government will have to show it's meeting these rules. It can't set them and then have a big red cross from the OBR saying, well, you've got no chance of meeting them. It mustn't be met with gimmicks. Because you can always find ways of changing borrowing or debt and using gimmicks. It often gets difficult after a while. But I'll tell you one gimmick that I'll be looking at very strongly for, which will be that they'll pencil in very, very steep spending cuts for the years after the end of the spending review period. So for after April 2025, which of course is after the next election. So if the government says that it will have iron control over public spending, but only after an election, well, it's got no credibility whatsoever. And then the fiscal rules won't. And then I think, again, you have to worry about what the market reaction is. We've already had one fiscal event that's had extremely poor market reaction, and we don't want to. On productivity, no, I don't think it's misplaced. I think it's exactly what we should be focused on. It's just very difficult. You can get long-term growth by having productivity growth, but that means that everyone's producing more, we get more out for what we put in, or you can have more people working. We've done a lot of that in the past decade. Our labour market works pretty well now. That was a real success of the Osborne, Cameron, Philip Hammond, Theresa May governments. It's only now that that's not working very well, and that's almost certainly some sort of post-COVID problem that does need fixing. So we can either have more people or the people can produce more. And if we can have people producing more, then everyone is better off. And so that's what we need to solve. It's just very difficult.
John?
Just very briefly, I agree with those comments. We obviously need credibility. I think we could possibly over-catastrophise just a little. We issued £1.2 billion of index-linked gilts on the 27th of September at a real yield of 0.277%. So the market is no longer paying us to borrow, but it's not as expensive as it could be. Our 10-year is yielding about 0.4% more than the United States. But on productivity, completely echo and thank Chris for his comments. I would note that although the labour market functions quite well, the housing market, and most particularly the supply of housing, does not. So there are many people who would gladly move to firms that could expand, much higher paying firms, were there homes in those places for them to live in.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions. Okay, can I have the gentleman here, and then can I have one online? Yep.
Hi, Jamie Jenkins, Director of Policy at Royal London. A lot has been said about the timing of this, so look at it as a package of announcements around growth and cutting taxes. Some people have said right thing, wrong time. Imagine we, or somebody at the time, had proposed this budget. I go back, the furthest I need to go back is 2019, so pre-pandemic war crisis. All the things that did us sense. Imagine this budget was applied in 2019, what do you think the reaction would be?
Thank you. And then can I take the question online?
Was the decision to scrap the Office of Tax Simplification a sensible or a foolhardy move?
Stuart, do you want to call it first?
Sure. So, scrapping the OTS, I find it hard to see how scrapping the OTS will help you achieve more tax simplification. I think the OTS has been doing a useful job. I don't think it's been doing a transformational job, and that's partly because, you know, not unreasonably, the really big things you can do involve actually, you know, doing things to the underlying policy, and that has to involve politicians somewhere along the line. And where the OTS has stretched its remit and suggested things that are relatively radical reform, it's got less traction. It's had most impact in terms of relatively small simplifications around the edges, and I think that is still worthwhile, and I'm sorry it's going, but I don't actually think it's, and apologies to my friends in the OTS, I don't think it's actually that transformational either way. Right budget, wrong time. I think in some ways it is a particularly awkward time for this budget. And so, well, it also depends what you're including. And so I completely take the Chancellor's point. There was an urgency about doing something big on energy prices. And you know, he did that and had to do it quickly. It's not obvious to me that you had to do the tax cuts right now. And I think there's a real downside to doing the tax cuts right now, not least because, as we've been saying before, any giveaways that you do now add to inflationary pressures and add to the likely rise in interest rates. And given that there are some things that you need to do, so to help the most vulnerable in particular, but to help people more generally with energy costs, and bear in mind, you know, people are still going to be struggling. It was a big help, but it's not exactly solved problems with rising cost of living. There is going to be issues with businesses after the 6 months they provided it. You know, there are pressures on public services and so on. Whether now is the right time to give money away, or rather give money back to people that didn't really need it right now, I'm a bit doubtful of. The broader issue that I think would have applied at any time is just the sheer scale of unfunded tax cuts with no indication of where the money is going to come from, and you know, no specifics on fiscal plan, no OBR analysis to go alongside it. Any of that, I think that would have been bad at any time.
Anyone want to make any comments here?
I'll make one comment about the OTS because I disagree with Stuart on this. I think it was a good move to get rid of it. It's much better to get rid of a quango that has no power and chances all the time than just allow it to keep making policy recommendations which just get put on a shelf.
Okay. Should we take some more questions then? I think it was a gentleman over here who had his hand up earlier. And then there's one at the back.
Yes, Tony Alford, West Dorset. I haven't seen any commentators questioning the growth rate assumption, and I wonder whether it is sufficiently ambitious. What does the panel think?
Okay, and then can we take the gentleman unfortunately, right in the far corner over there?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I'd just be interested on your thoughts about the role of taxation and incentive for work, which was questioned earlier. The real issue, it seems to me, is that the top rate of tax is not 45% at 150, it's 62% at 100. And between 100, roughly 100 and 125, people are paying 62% tax. That's never been stated as the top rate of tax, but in practical terms it is. And it seems to me that that is hugely important in incentivising work. That's why you can't get doctors to work overtime, because they're getting, they're paying 62% tax. And I'm told that a lot of people at the 20 to 40% tax rate will down tools on a Wednesday, and they won't work a Thursday and a Friday if it means they're hitting the 40% tax, simply because they have different standards of living. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. The experts.
Okay, so we've got the growth rate and a challenge to it, and then obviously the role of taxation and incentivising people to work. I don't know, do you want to, Chris?
I'll say something very briefly on both those. well, we can have any growth target we like. We could say 10% a year. And it won't happen. So if we want to have targets that we don't meet, we can have them. It doesn't really matter, though. In the end, the fiscal forecast will be based not on the Chancellor's 2.5% target, but on what the OBR think is a reasonable assumption for productivity growth and underlying growth in the economy. And if there's one mistake, here's a real good criticism that you can all make of the OBR. The consistent mistake the OBR has made in the 12 years of its existence has been far too optimistic about productivity growth. So it's actually very difficult, and it should be very difficult to persuade the OBR that the Chancellor's 2.5% growth rate will be achieved, because they've been listening far too much to Chancellors saying we're going to get growth in the past, and it just hasn't occurred. On the top rate, I think you make a good point. It's much more distortionary. What would I do about it? Well, I'm probably not the right person. I would get rid of the abolition of the personal allowance, but have a higher top rate of tax for everyone. So not have a 40%, but have whatever makes up the amount of money.
Stuart, you want to make a few points?
Sure. Again, broadly going to agree with Chris. I think on the growth issue, I think that the point is that the question is it an assumption or is it an ambition? You can set your ambition as high as you like, but your assumption should be, either your best guess or err on the side of caution. I'm wary about assuming that you get a high growth rate. If you want to try and get as high as you can, then great. So the role of tax in work incentives, yes, absolutely. I've been railing against the opaque high marginal tax rate implied by the tapering of the personal allowance ever since they announced it about, well, whatever it was, 12, 13 years ago. Now, you can actually get even higher marginal rates than that if you look at the withdrawal of child benefit, high-income child benefit charge over 50,000, depending on how many kids you've got, in a slightly bizarre way. And, of course, if you think of the effective tax rates entailed in means test benefit withdrawal, those can get much higher still. And you can get other things as well, like the implicit taxation when your pension allowance is tapered away, which is a lot of what was going on with doctors, rather than just being the rate. I would also say that things like that are more important for complexity than just having a third marginal rate of 45 as well as a basic and a higher rate, although actually the real complexity isn't around any of those things. It's about how you define taxable income is where it gets really complicated. Yes, that was both questions. I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm conscious John, you wanted to come in.
Just quickly, so I agree the 60% rate is, marginal rate is very distortionary, and we need to fix that. On growth, I applaud your ambition, sir, and I would agree with Chris and Stuart that we should aim to do much better on growth. Whether it is safe to assume better than 2.5% on growth is a different question. Getting more growth requires hard, detailed work on some of these structural questions. It involves working out how we help communities to share some of the benefits of planning reform so that they are in favour of good quality development. It involves finding ways to improve childcare provision without creating unsafe conditions. Detailed work. We need to upskill the civil service. We may need to upskill some of our politicians as well to achieve that.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're sort of up against time, so I'm going to take a couple more questions and then that'll be it. So I don't know if you've got a couple more. Anyone got online? Yep.
So I've got two more questions from online.
Okay, thanks.
The first one, are the tax cuts that have been announced sustainable, given that the cost and amount of borrowing has increased significantly? And the second one is in relation to the IR35 changes. Are they going to help to simplify the tax system, or is it the case that HMRC are now going to find themselves bogged down in correspondence with individual contractors?
Okay, so we've got a question about tax cuts and a question about IR35. Do you want to?
Sure. So, are the tax cuts sustainable? I would say probably not without spending cuts as well. I would need a lot more convincing to have confident that we can get growth up enough to have those tax cuts without cutting spending. But of course, if the market lets you, you don't necessarily have to do the spending cuts quite yet. And I can certainly imagine exactly what Chris was talking about, that he pencils in, frankly, implausibly tight departmental spending cuts for after the next election, strangely enough. On aisle 35, is it a simplification? Not really. I mean, it simplifies things a bit for business. It makes things more complicated again for the contractors. I disagree slightly with what Chris was saying earlier on that. He was saying this is 2 billion of extra evasion. It's 2 billion less tax being paid with theoretical liabilities unaffected. That's partly more evasion if it's the individual that has to do it, but it could also be in the existing system when businesses have responsibility for it, they're having an abundance of caution and classifying people as employees or for tax purposes when actually they don't need to. So you're reducing one risk of people of more tax being paid than really needs to be paid, and increasing the risk of less tax being paid than really needs to be paid. Which of those you think is the bigger problem, I think, is an open question. And similarly, you're reducing the burdens on firms, you're increasing the burdens on individuals and probably on HMRC, who now have more individual people to deal with than if they were dealing with companies using lots of contractors. I think the more fundamental point that we haven't mentioned that really needs emphasising is that we should try and get away from the situation where any of this matters, because we've got this massive differential in how much tax is payable according to the legal form in which work is being done, and therefore we're having to draw a line in the sand somewhere. Wherever you draw that boundary, wherever you put the legal responsibility for determining it, it's going to cause you problems. So let's try and even out the tax treatment of different legal forms of doing work a bit more so that we don't have any of the problems to the extent that we do.
I think that's probably it for today then. So thank you very much to my panellists, to Stuart, to Chris and to John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.